The painting wasn't working. Lily stood back from the canvas, brush suspended in mid-air, studying the way shadows played across the hospital corridor she'd been trying to capture for hours. Something felt off, not in the technique, but in the emotion. The same nagging feeling that had been haunting her for weeks. Still working on that commission for the children's ward? Alex's voice startled her. He stood in the doorway of her studio, still wearing his surgical scrubs, dark circles under his eyes suggesting another long shift. "I thought you'd be home earlier," Lily said, carefully setting down her brush. The clock on the wall showed 11:43 p.m. The Jensen surgery couldn't have taken this long. Alex ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair, a gesture she'd once found endearing. Now it seemed like a tell, something he did when choosing his words carefully. Complications. Had to monitor the patient's response post-op. He loosened his tie, not quite meeting her eyes. "You didn't have to wait up." Lily watched him move across their bedroom toward the master bath, noticed the slight hesitation in his step. After 15 years of marriage, she could read his body language like one of her own canvases. Something was off in the composition. "Sarah from the hospital board called," she said casually, cleaning her brush with practice strokes. "She wanted to thank you for staying late to handle that emergency appendectomy." Alex froze, hand on the bathroom doorknob. For just a moment, his reflection in the mirror showed something: panic, guilt, before his features smoothed back into professional neutrality. "Must have been after the Jensen case," he said. "It's been a blur of a day." Lily felt her heart rate quicken, but kept her voice steady. "Funny. Sarah called at 7. Said she was heading home for the day." She set down the brush harder than necessary, turpentine splashing onto her smock. "Want to try again?" The silence stretched between them like a canvas waiting for the first stroke. Alex turned slowly, and Lily saw something she'd never seen before in his eyes: fear. "Lil, it's not what you think dash." "What exactly do I think, Alex?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of every suspicion she'd been pushing away for months. The late nights. The mysterious phone calls. The way he'd stopped sharing details about his day. "I'm handling a sensitive case," he said finally. "There are confidentiality issues. I can't dash." Confidentiality. Lily laughed, the sound harsh in the quiet room. "Is that what we're calling it now?" She walked to his discarded lab coat, hanging by the door. Before he could stop her, she reached into the pocket and pulled out an envelope, cream-colored, expensive paper, unsealed. The kind of stationery a woman might choose for a love letter. "I was going to do laundry," she said, holding up the envelope. "Found this instead. Should I read it? Or would that violate doctor-patient confidentiality too?" Alex's face drained of color. "Lily, please. I can explain everything." But Lily was already opening the letter, her artist's hands steady even as her world tilted on its axis. The first line jumped out at her like a slash of red paint across a pristine canvas. "My dearest Alexander." She looked up at her husband, this man she'd loved for nearly 2 decades, whose children she'd dreamed of having, whose career she'd supported through endless nights of residency and fellowship. In the harsh overhead light, she saw him clearly for the first time in months, a stranger wearing her husband's face. "Well," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm listening." Alex took a step toward her, hands raised in supplication. "It's not real," he said quickly. "The letter, it's just a joke. The nurses, they sometimes pull pranks dash. Don't." Lily held up a hand, stopping him in his tracks. "Don't you dare lie to me again." Outside their bedroom window, a siren wailed in the distance, another emergency, another crisis, another life hanging in the balance. But in that moment, all Lily could focus on was the sound of her own heartbeat, thundering in her ears like a drum signaling the end of everything she'd thought was real. "I think," she said carefully, setting the letter down on her painting table, "You should sleep in the guest room tonight. Lily dash. And tomorrow," she continued as if he hadn't spoken, "you're going to tell me the truth. All of it. Or the next time you come home, your keys won't work in the lock." She turned back to her canvas, picking up her brush with trembling fingers. Behind her, she heard Alex's footsteps retreat, the soft click of the guest room door closing. Only then did she allow herself to look at the hospital corridor she'd been painting, sterile, white, full of secrets. With deliberate strokes, she began adding shadows, darker and deeper than before. Sometimes, she thought, you had to embrace the darkness to find your way back to the light. The letter sat on her table, its contents still unread, a ticking bomb waiting to shatter what remained of her perfect life. Tomorrow, she would demand answers. Tomorrow, she would be strong. Tonight, she would paint her pain into something beautiful, and try to ignore the sound of her heart breaking in the silence of their home. Morning arrived like a bruise, tender and unwelcome. Lily hadn't slept, spending the night alternating between staring at the unopened letter and adding harsh strokes to her painting. The hospital corridor on her canvas had transformed into something darker, more threatening, shadows creeping along the walls like living things. The sound of Alex in the kitchen downstairs made her hands shake. The familiar routine of him making coffee, their Sunday morning ritual for 15 years, now felt like a violation. She could picture him down there, methodically measuring beans into the grinder, heating water to exactly 200 degrees, trying to pretend everything was normal. Nothing would ever be normal again. Lily dressed with deliberate care, armor for the battle ahead, her best jeans, a silk blouse in deep burgundy that made her feel strong. No makeup, she wanted him to see exactly what this night had cost her. The mirror reflected shadows under her eyes, skin pale against her dark hair. She looked like one of her own paintings, all stark contrasts and hidden meanings. When she finally descended the stairs, Alex was waiting at the kitchen island, 2 cups of coffee steaming between them. He'd changed into fresh clothes, but couldn't hide his own sleepless night. Good, she thought. Let him suffer too. "I read it," she said without preamble, placing the letter on the granite countertop. The cream-colored paper seemed to glow in the morning light streaming through their bay windows. All of it. 3 times, actually. Alex's hands tightened around his coffee mug. "Lily, I can explain dash. Can you?" Her voice was steady, controlled, the voice she used when negotiating with gallery owners. "Can you explain why a woman I've never met calls you, my dearest Alexander? Why she writes about your gentle hands and stolen moments? Why she threatens to tell everyone everything unless you meet her demands? It's not what it seems." Alex pushed away from the counter, pacing their kitchen like a caged animal. She's a patient. Former patient. Things got complicated dash. Complicated. Lily's laugh held no humor. "That's one word for it. Ethical violation might be another. Or betrayal. Take your pick. You don't understand dash. Then make me understand." The coffee mug shattered against the wall, dark liquid running down the pale paint like tears. Neither of them moved to clean it up. "Tell me why my husband, the man I've loved since medical school, is getting love letters from patients. Tell me why you've been lying about your late nights. Tell me why you flinch every time your phone rings." Alex stopped pacing, his face a mask of anguish. "I can't. God, Lily, I wish I could tell you everything, but I can't. It would put you in danger." The word hung between them like smoke. Danger. Not the danger of losing their marriage, not the danger to his medical license, something else. Something that put fear in his eyes and tension in every line of his body. What kind of danger? Lily's artist's eye caught every detail, the way his hands trembled, the slight flush creeping up his neck, the bead of sweat at his temple despite the cool morning air. "Please," he whispered. "Please trust me. Just a little longer." I'm handling it. Like you've been handling it for the past 3 months. Lily pulled out her phone, fingers flying across the screen. While you were sleeping, I did some research. Called in some favors. Your nurse, Rachel. She told me interesting things about your late-night patient consultations. About a woman who keeps showing up at the hospital asking for you. About how you've been acting strange, distracted. Alex's face went white. You talked to Rachel? I talked to everyone, Alex. The parking attendant. The night security guard. The janitor who works the late shift. You'd be amazed what people notice. What they're willing to share when a crying wife calls in the middle of the night. She watched the implications sink in, saw the moment he realized just how thoroughly she'd investigated during those sleepless hours. The great Dr. Alexander Pierce, renowned surgeon, pillar of the community, brought low by the simple act of people paying attention. So here's what happens next, Lily continued, her voice soft but implacable. You're going to sit down and tell me everything. Not the sanitized version, not the protecting my wife version. Everything. Or I'm going to take what I've learned, including this letter, to the hospital board. You wouldn't. But his voice held uncertainty. Try me. Lily leaned forward, hands flat on the counter. Our marriage is hanging by a thread, Alex. The only thing that might save it is the truth. All of it. Now. Alex sank into a kitchen chair, suddenly looking every one of his 47 years. You're right, he said finally. You deserve the truth. But Lily, once I tell you, there's no going back. Our lives will never be the same. Our lives stopped being the same the moment I found that letter. Lily sat across from him, close enough to smell his familiar cologne, far enough to maintain her resolve. Start talking. As Alex opened his mouth to begin, his phone buzzed on the counter. They both stared at it, watching an unknown number flash across the screen. The sound filled their kitchen like a warning bell, counting down to a revelation that would either save their marriage or destroy it completely. On the third ring, Alex reached for the phone with trembling fingers, his eyes never leaving Lily's face. I have to answer this, he whispered. But first you need to know that everything I've done, every lie I've told, it was to protect you. To protect us. The phone kept ringing, its harsh buzz a counterpoint to the sound of their marriage cracking apart, one secret at a time. The hospital corridors felt different to Lily now, transformed from the familiar backdrop of her husband's career into something more sinister. Her footsteps echoed against the polished floors as she made her way to the nurse's station, each step carrying the weight of her sleepless nights and unanswered questions. Alex had taken that phone call in private, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. When he emerged from his study, his face was ashen. I have to go to the hospital, he'd said, already reaching for his keys. Emergency surgery. But his hands were shaking too badly to be preparing for surgery, and his eyes held something Lily had never seen before, raw fear. So she'd followed him, maintaining a careful distance in traffic, watching him park in his usual spot. But instead of heading to the surgical wing, he'd disappeared into the psychiatric ward. That's when she decided to find Rachel. The red-haired nurse was exactly where Lily expected, organizing charts with methodical precision. Rachel looked up, and recognition flickered across her face, followed quickly by concern. Mrs. Pierce, she said softly, glancing around before stepping closer. You shouldn't be here. I need to understand, Lily replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Alex he's not himself. And after our conversation last night, I thought maybe you could help me understand why. Rachel's hands stilled on the charts. Follow me, she said after a long moment. She led Lily to a small break room, checking to ensure they were alone before closing the door. What I'm about to tell you, it could cost me my job. But you deserve to know. And honestly, I'm worried about Dr. Pierce. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Rachel sank into a chair, suddenly looking exhausted. It started about 3 months ago. A new patient was admitted to the psychiatric ward, severe trauma case, history of manipulation and violence. Dr. Pierce was called in for a surgical consult, routine procedure. But something about this patient, she fixated on him. Lily's throat tightened. The woman who's been sending him letters. Rachel nodded. Her name is Claire Morrison. On paper, she's a victim, abusive relationships, multiple hospitalizations. But there's something off about her. The way she watches people, calculates their weaknesses. She started requesting Dr. Pierce specifically, claiming complications from the surgery. When he tried to refer her to other doctors, she became unstable. Unstable how? She'd show up at odd hours, crying, demanding to see him. Security had to escort her out more than once. Then the letters started, graphic descriptions of imagined encounters, threats to hurt herself if he didn't respond. When that didn't work, Rachel hesitated, then continued in a lower voice, she started talking about you. A chill ran down Lily's spine. Me? She'd done her research. Knew about your art, your gallery showings. Started showing up at your exhibitions, though you never noticed her. She'd tell Dr. Pierce in detail about watching you, following you. Said if he didn't comply with her demands, something might happen to you. Lily's legs felt weak. She gripped the edge of the table, remembering strange moments over the past months, a glimpse of someone watching her at the gallery, footsteps that seemed to echo her own while walking home, hang-up calls in the middle of the night. Why didn't he tell me, she whispered, but even as she asked, she knew. Alex had been trying to protect her, bearing this burden alone rather than frightening her. He tried to handle it through proper channels, Rachel continued. Filed reports, got restraining orders. But Claire knows the system, she's careful to stay just on the legal side of harassment. And she's convincing when she wants to be. Can make herself seem so vulnerable that even experienced staff members start doubting their instincts. A commotion in the hallway made them both jump. Through the break room's small window, Lily caught a glimpse of Alex striding past, his face set in grim lines. Following close behind was a woman she'd never seen before, slight build, honey blonde hair, designer clothes that somehow looked wrong on her frame. Like a costume worn by someone playing a part. That's her, Rachel whispered unnecessarily. Claire. Lily watched as the woman reached out, touching Alex's arm with familiar intimacy. Even from this distance, she could see how he flinched, though his professional mask never slipped. They disappeared around a corner, heading toward the psychiatric wing. He's trying to protect his patient's privacy, Rachel said gently. But he's also trying to protect you. The things she's threatened to do, they keep getting worse. More specific. Last week, she described in detail how she could break into your studio while you're working late. Said she knows you like to listen to music with headphones while you paint, that you wouldn't hear someone coming up behind you. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Lily remembered countless nights alone in her studio, lost in her art, completely unaware of any danger. Had someone been watching her all that time? Planning? Waiting? I have to help him, she said, straightening her spine. We have to find a way to stop this. Rachel's expression shifted from concern to determination. I've been gathering documentation, incident reports, security footage, copies of the letters she accidentally left where staff would find them. It's not enough for criminal charges yet, but maybe. A scream cut through their conversation, high, desperate, coming from the direction Alex had gone. Both women froze, recognizing the sound of a situation spiraling out of control. Go, Rachel urged, already moving toward the door. Go home where it's safe. Let us handle this. But Lily was already moving in the opposite direction, toward the sound of breaking glass and raised voices. Toward her husband, who had been fighting this battle alone for far too long. No more running, she whispered to herself. No more hiding. Around the corner, chaos waited. And with it, answers that would change everything. The psychiatric wing's fluorescent lights cast everything in a harsh, unforgiving glow. Lily rounded the corner to find a scene that would haunt her paintings for months to come, Alex backed against a wall, his professional composure cracking, while Claire Morrison stood before him, a delicate hand pressed to her throat in a gesture that might have seemed vulnerable if not for the calculated gleam in her eyes. "You promised," Claire was saying, her voice carrying that peculiar mix of threat and fragility that made others want to protect her. "You promised you'd help me, Alexander. After everything we've shared." "Dr. Pierce," Alex corrected firmly, though Lily could see the slight tremor in his hands. "Ms. Morrison, we've discussed appropriate boundaries. I've arranged for Dr. Matthews to take over your care. They won't understand." Claire's voice rose sharply. "None of them understand me like you do. You've seen my scars, touched them, promised to make them better." Her fingers traced a path down her neck to her collarbone in a gesture both innocent and deliberately provocative. Lily felt her stomach clench, but not with jealousy. She recognized the manipulation for what it was now, a carefully choreographed performance designed to trap and isolate. How many times had Alex faced this alone, trying to maintain professional boundaries while protecting their family from escalating threats? "Step away from my husband." Lily's voice cut through the tension, steady and clear. Claire's head snapped toward her, eyes widening with an almost childlike pleasure that sent chills down Lily's spine. "Oh, the artist arrives. I've been dying to meet you properly." She moved toward Lily with fluid grace. "Your latest exhibition was breathtaking, especially that piece about vulnerability. The way you captured the light through broken glass. The exhibition that wasn't open to the public yet." Lily kept her voice level. "The one you watched me paint through my studio window at night." A flicker of something dark passed through Claire's eyes before her mask of innocence returned. "I don't know what you mean. Alexander and I were discussing my treatment. No more games." Lily stepped forward, positioning herself between Claire and Alex. "I've seen the letters. The threats. I know about the stalking, the psychological manipulation, the careful escalation of pressure. It stops now." Claire's facade cracked for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. "You have no idea what you're talking about. Alexander and I have a special connection. He understands my pain, my needs." She turned to Alex, voice trembling. "Tell her. Tell her how you hold me when I cry, how you promise to take care of me." "The only thing Dr. Pierce promised was to provide medical care," Rachel's voice rang out from the doorway. She wasn't alone, 2 security guards and Dr. Matthews, the head of psychiatry, stood with her. "We have documentation of every interaction, every false claim, every escalating threat." Claire's transformation was instant and chilling. The vulnerable patient vanished, replaced by something harder, more dangerous. "Documentation?" She laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "I have documentation too. Videos, recordings. What would the medical board think about a doctor taking advantage of a traumatized patient?" "They'd see exactly what happened," Lily said quietly, reaching for Alex's hand. "Every call logged, every security camera showing you following him, every witness statement about your threats against me. The truth doesn't bend to your will, Claire. Not anymore." "You're all the same," Claire spat, mask completely gone now. "Think you're so perfect, so righteous. But I know the truth. I know what men like him are really capable of. They all pretend to care, to want to help, but in the end." Her hand moved to her pocket with practiced speed. "Claire." Dr. Matthews' voice was firm but gentle. "Put down the scissors." Time seemed to slow. Lily saw the glint of metal in Claire's hand, saw Alex move to pull her back, saw Rachel reaching for the panic button. But it was Claire's eyes that held her attention, eyes that reflected not anger or hatred, but a deep, haunting pain that spoke of old wounds never properly healed. "You don't understand," Claire whispered, fingers tightening around the scissors. "None of you understand. He was supposed to fix everything. Make the pain stop. Make me whole again." "I understand pain," Lily said softly, not moving. "I understand what it's like to feel betrayed, to have your trust broken. To want someone to put all the pieces back together. But this isn't the way, Claire. This won't heal what's hurting you." For a moment, just a moment, something real flashed across Claire's face, recognition, perhaps, or a glimpse of the person she might have been before trauma twisted her understanding of love and trust. Then her features hardened again, and she lunged forward with the scissors raised. What happened next would play out in Lily's mind in slow motion for months to come: the swift intervention of the security guards, Claire's anguished scream, the clatter of metal on tile. And underneath it all, Alex's arms around her, shielding her, finally able to protect her openly instead of from the shadows. As they led Claire away, her mask cracked completely, revealing the raw pain beneath. "You promised," she screamed at Alex. "You promised you'd never abandon me like they did." Lily felt Alex flinch at the words, saw the weight of all those months of silent struggle in his eyes. She tightened her grip on his hand, grounding him in the present, in the truth of their connection. "I'm here," she whispered, for his ears alone. "We'll face this together now." But as Claire's screams echoed down the corridor, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't really the end. Some storms leave traces long after they pass, and the shadows of trust, once broken, take time to heal. The art studio had become their sanctuary in the weeks following Claire's breakdown. Lily found herself returning to her paints each evening, working through emotions she couldn't yet voice, while Alex sat quietly in the old armchair by the window. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they just existed together in the silence, relearning the rhythm of trust. Tonight, Lily was reworking the hospital corridor painting that had started it all. The harsh shadows were still there, but now she was adding something new, threads of light breaking through, illuminating hidden corners, transforming darkness into something more nuanced. "I keep thinking about her eyes," Alex said softly, breaking their comfortable silence. "That moment when everything stripped away, and we saw the real pain underneath." He hadn't spoken much about Claire since that day, carrying the weight of those months in quiet contemplation. Lily set down her brush, studying her husband's face in the fading evening light. The dark circles under his eyes had begun to fade, but something vulnerable remained in his expression, a new softness that came from finally sharing his burden. "You tried to protect everyone," she said gently. "Her. Me. Your other patients. Even yourself." She moved to perch on the arm of his chair, close enough to offer comfort but giving him space to find his words. "I thought I could handle it. That's what we're trained for, you know. To maintain boundaries while showing compassion, to help without becoming emotionally involved." His voice caught slightly. "But she knew exactly how to push those boundaries, how to use my need to help against me. Every threat against you felt like a personal failure." Lily reached for his hand, feeling the familiar calluses from years of surgical work. "Dr. Matthews told me about Claire's history. About the doctors who actually did take advantage of her vulnerability, who broke their oaths and her trust. You were different. You tried to help while maintaining ethical boundaries, even when it cost you everything." "Not everything," Alex said quietly, squeezing her hand. "Not you." "No," Lily agreed. "Not me. But Alex, you have to understand how close we came to losing each other. Not because of Claire's manipulation, but because you tried to carry this alone." She stood, moving to the canvas where the hospital corridor was slowly transforming under her brush. "Look at this painting. See how the shadows define the light. How they give depth and meaning to the brighter spaces. That's what we're learning, isn't it? That darkness doesn't have to consume us. That we're stronger when we face it together." Alex moved to stand behind her, studying the painting with new understanding. The way you've layered the colors, it's like looking at healing itself. Messy. Complex. But beautiful. I started seeing Dr. Richardson, Lily said softly, referring to the trauma counselor they'd both been recommended. She's helping me process everything, not just Claire's threats, but the fear of losing you, the way trauma ripples outward and affects everyone it touches. I've been seeing someone too, Alex admitted. Dr. Chen. He's helping me understand why I felt so compelled to handle everything alone. It goes back further than Claire, patterns I developed in residency, watching my father's struggles with his own medical practice. Lily turned to face him, reaching up to trace the lines of worry that had become so familiar on his face. We're both learning, aren't we? That strength isn't about bearing weight alone. That trust isn't about perfect certainty, but about choosing to be vulnerable together. I miss you, Alex whispered, the words carrying all the longing of their weeks sleeping in separate rooms, maintaining careful distance while they both healed. I'm right here, Lily replied. We both are. Different, maybe. Changed by what we've been through. But still us. She led him to the window seat where they used to sit together during easier times, watching the city lights flicker to life in the growing dusk. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, another emergency, another crisis, another story unfolding. But here in this space, they were creating their own story of healing. Tell me about your day, Lily said softly. Not the sanitized version. Not the protecting my wife version. Just, your day. Your fears. Your hopes. Everything. Alex was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice held a new kind of honesty, raw, unfiltered, truly intimate. I saw a patient today who reminded me of Claire. Not in her actions, but in her pain. For a moment, I froze. Dr. Matthews noticed, stepped in to help. We talked about it afterward, about developing better support systems, about recognizing our own triggers and limitations. As Alex's words filled the studio, Lily reached for her sketchbook, beginning to capture this moment, not in dramatic shadows and light, but in soft, gentle strokes. A man and woman sitting together in growing darkness, learning to shine light into each other's shadows, one truth at a time. The healing wasn't complete. There would be more difficult conversations, more moments of vulnerability and doubt. But here, in the quiet of their sanctuary, they were building something new, a partnership strengthened by adversity, a love tempered by understanding, a trust deeper than silence. 6 months after Claire, Lily stood in the newly renovated children's ward, surrounded by her completed murals. What had started as a single commission piece had evolved into something more profound, a series of healing landscapes that transformed sterile hospital walls into windows of hope. Each scene told a story of light breaking through darkness, of beauty emerging from pain. The centerpiece, hanging where the corridor curved toward the recovery rooms, was the painting that had witnessed the unraveling of her marriage, and its eventual rebirth. But it was different now. The hospital corridor she'd originally captured had evolved into something more symbolic, a path through shadows that opened onto a dawnlit garden, where broken things grew into new forms of beauty. You've captured it perfectly, Alex's voice came from behind her, warm and certain in a way it hadn't been for so long. The journey through darkness into light. Lily turned to face her husband, seeing in his eyes the same quiet strength she'd worked to embed in her paintings. The past months had changed them both, not back to who they were before, but into something deeper, more resilient. The hospital board meeting went well, she asked, though she could read the answer in his posture, the way his shoulders had lost their defensive hunch. Better than expected. Alex moved to stand beside her, their shoulders touching in the comfortable way they'd rediscovered. Dr. Matthews presented the new protocols we developed, stricter boundaries for patient interactions, better support systems for staff dealing with challenging cases, mandatory counseling resources. They're implementing them system-wide. Your experience is helping protect others, Lily said softly, reaching for his hand. That matters. Claire's former therapist reached out, Alex added after a moment. She's responding well to the new treatment program. Learning to process her trauma without weaponizing it against others. He paused, choosing his words carefully. She asked about writing us a letter of apology. I told them we'd need time to consider whether we're ready for that. Lily squeezed his hand, acknowledging the complexity of emotions in his voice. They'd learned that healing wasn't about perfect closure or neat endings. Sometimes it was about accepting the messy reality of human pain, about finding compassion without compromising boundaries. Look who I found in the parking lot, Rachel's cheerful voice interrupted their reflection. She entered pushing a wheelchair carrying Mrs. Henderson, one of Alex's long-term patients and an unexpected source of wisdom during their darkest days. I couldn't miss the grand unveiling, Mrs. Henderson announced, her eyes bright despite her recent surgery. Especially not after all those nights of watching this one sketch out her ideas in my room during my insomnia episodes. Lily smiled, remembering those late-night conversations. She'd started visiting Mrs. Henderson during her extended recovery, initially just to check on one of Alex's patients, but the elderly woman's insight and quiet strength had become a touchstone for them both. You told me something important during those nights, Lily said, helping Mrs. Henderson maneuver closer to the mural. About how love isn't just about the beautiful moments, but about choosing each other especially when things are broken. And how are you two doing with that choosing? Mrs. Henderson asked, her wise eyes moving between them. Alex and Lily exchanged a glance heavy with shared understanding. We're learning, Alex said quietly. About balance. About letting people help. About the difference between protecting and partnering. We have our moments, Lily added honestly. Times when the shadows feel heavy, when trust feels fragile. But we're facing them together now. No more closed doors. No more silent battles. Rachel smiled, adjusting Mrs. Henderson's blanket. The whole ward feels different these days. More open. More connected. Your story, it changed things. Helped us all understand the importance of reaching out, of noticing when someone's carrying too much alone. Sometimes healing looks like this, Mrs. Henderson observed, gesturing to the mural. Not a perfect erasure of darkness, but a gradual dawn. Each day a little brighter than the last. As if in response to her words, the setting sun broke through the windows, casting long rays across the painted landscape. The light caught the layers of color in ways Lily hadn't anticipated, revealing subtle details, a butterfly emerging from shadows, broken branches sprouting new leaves, paths leading to unexplored horizons. I've been thinking, Alex said, his voice carrying the tone that Lily had learned meant he was stepping into vulnerability. About taking some time off. Not just a weekend, but real time. That cottage on the coast you've always wanted to paint. The one with the wild gardens and the lighthouse view. Lily felt something spark in her chest, not the old, unquestioning joy, but something more mature. Hope tempered by experience, love strengthened by trial. I thought, maybe we could go there. Take some time to just be us again. Not doctor and artist, not survivors of trauma, just us. Writing our next chapter together. Mrs. Henderson made a satisfied sound. Now that's what healing looks like. Not running from the past, but walking together towards something new. As the evening light painted their small group in gentle gold, Lily looked at her mural one last time. The hospital corridor she'd originally planned to paint felt like a lifetime ago. Instead, she'd created something that spoke to universal truths about human resilience, about the beauty that can emerge from brokenness, about the courage it takes to love after loss. Yes, she said simply, turning back to Alex. Let's write that next chapter together. Rachel began wheeling Mrs. Henderson toward her room, leaving them in the gentle quiet of the fading day. Around them, the hospital continued its eternal rhythm of crisis and healing, loss and hope. But here, in this moment, they had found their own kind of peace, not perfect, not unbreakable, but real and deeply earned. Alex drew Lily close, and together they stood watching darkness soften into dusk, each holding the other's scars like precious things, each choosing love not despite their brokenness but because of how it had taught them to heal.